Test, test. Okay, bang the gavel for the last time. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to the final meeting of this term's Electoral Area Services Committee. I'd like to note that this meeting is taking place in the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. And I'd like to also bring to everyone's attention, we have a couple of items for consideration of under new business. The NB1 is an Area B grant in aid, and NB2 will be an Area E recommendation for some work around ALC and cannabis regulations. So put that to the committee. Director Acton, move the agenda as amended. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Director Marcotte. Any discussion on the agenda? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Those opposed? The motion carries. Adoption of the minutes of our October 17th meeting. Moved by Director. Oh, yes. We're pulling that. What would you recommend we should probably amend that now? Ms. Harrison? We neglected to pull R3, which we want to pull R3. Refer it back to staff when we get to it? Yeah, we'll do that. Thank you, Director Yanni DiNardo. Motion for adoption of the minutes of the last meeting, moved by Director Davis, seconded by Director Acton. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Those opposed, the motion carries. Mr. Blackwell, any business arising from those minutes?
No business arising.
Thank you. Public input period. This time offers members of the public the opportunity to provide input to the committee on matters on today's agenda. Does anybody have any input they'd like to provide committee today? It's looking like there's no input today, so we will move to number 5, delegations. There's no delegations. I don't believe we have any correspondence. Information, we have 2 items for information. Area C, Parks Commission minutes, and Area D, Parks Commission minutes. Any discussion of those items? Seeing none. On to reports. R1, Ms. Garnett. Welcome.
Thank you. This is an application for a development permit within Electoral Area B. The subject property, there are properties, they're zoned RR2. They're located in the Baldy Mountain area of Shawnigan Lake. You can see from this image that the majority of the parcels is forested, except for a small portion that contains the existing single-family home. One of the parcels is currently vacant. It is solely forested. So it's a rural residential area with quite steep topography. The minimum lot size in this zone is 2 hectares, and that minimum lot size applies to the newly created lots, but there are 2 adjacent lots here, so not all of the proposed lots actually meet the 2 hectare minimum lot size, but they still comply with the zoning bylaw. The subject parcels are in the Rural Character Development Permit area of the South Cowichan Official Community Plan. A couple of site photos, you can see a very forested road and some slope. That's a view eastward along Hawkins Road. And that's on the other side of the property, view looking sort of southwards on Strathcona Heights Road. A geotechnical assessment was submitted for this application, which addresses the majority of the development permit guidelines, including drainage that this property or the subject parcels receive from the upland area. It also deals with natural hazards. There's very low risk of natural hazards. It's safe for the proposed residential use. The geotechnical assessment also recommends limiting the hard surfaces on the proposed new lots and maintaining a vegetative buffer on the lowest side of the subject parcels, except for the proposed driveway. This is the proposed subdivision plan. The application complies with the zoning bylaw and adequately meets the development permit guidelines, and staff recommend the application be approved. Thank you.
Any questions for staff? Director Acton.
Thank you. So it's creating a 1 hectare lot, and so that's not increasing the density, but then it leaves a 4 hectare lot. Is there concern that that would be requested to be subdivided at some point, or what is the zoning around that?
Ms. Garnett.
So the proposed parcels will be, let me just take a look at the proposed new lots are 2 hectares, 3 hectares, and 1 hectare in size. So there's no potential subdivision once, so this is sort of maximizing. And again, that 1 hectare minimum, or 1 hectare lot that's proposed, it doesn't meet the 2 hectare minimum lot size of the RR2 zone, but that's because there are already 2 existing parcels there. So it's being permitted under sort of the boundary adjustment provisions of the zoning bylaw.
Director Nicholson.
Thank you. I think I've asked this before, but I want some clarification again. When I read the geotechnical report, it wasn't clear to me how they had considered climate change projections in doing their stormwater drainage work. And so I'm wondering, is there a way that we can require them in their stormwater reports and environmental assessments to be more transparent about how they consider climate change projections?
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you. The short answer is not really. We cannot influence the integrity of the report prepared by them. That said, excuse me, there's the ability to establish criteria that they need to respond to. So we have not, at the CVRD, developed a level of sophistication around development permit regulations, primarily because there was no, as I understand it, appetite to have anything more rigorous than what we have. And so there is, to a degree, the ability to prescribe these requirements in development permit guidelines so that when the geotechnical engineer or any other professional preparing a report to respond to DP guidelines, that they take those matters into consideration. So perhaps through the modernization process, that is exactly the type of issue that we need to bring forward and assess the level of appetite and the commensurate degree of sophistication that is expected around that type of thing. Of course, the more rigorous, the more costly, and so applicants will typically push back with respect to increased costs associated with development applications. So that's going to have to be a matter that's discussed and considered at this table.
Follow-up, Director Nicholson.
So you know I have a hearty appetite for including climate change in our, I'm only asking that it be done in a transparent manner. So I know right now that many of these professionals already consider it. And in fact, I called this one up and he explained to me exactly how he considered it, but it isn't transparent in the reports. And I think as a first step, we should be able to very easily and without many staff resources, just have a blanket change to our development permits. So wherever they're required to do these assessments, that they're transparent about how they've considered climate change. That's all. So they can decide how to do it at this point in time, but they should be transparent about it.
Thank you, and I'm hoping, because I think there's other development permit areas around slope stability and some others that I think that those considerations that you mentioned are more than appropriate. And I think the next board will, and electoral area services should perhaps take a look at the degree that they'd want to pursue that. I think it's important. Any other questions for staff? Seeing none, I turn to the director for the area. Move the recommendation, seconded by Director Nicholson. Any further discussion on this? Mr. Blackwell, would you read the recommendation, please?
Thank you. Yes, the recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board, 1, development permit application number DP 18B16 at 1581 Strathcona Heights Road be approved, permitting subdivision of 2 parcels into 3 new parcels. And 2, that the general manager of land use services be authorized to permit minor revisions to the permit in accordance with the intent of DP guidelines of OCP, bylaw number 3510.
All heard the resolution, call the question. All those in favor and those opposed, that motion carries. And at this point, it's anticipated these will be going to the Wednesday, November 14th board. Thank you, Allison. Next item are 2, Mr. Batstone.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. This application is with respect to a development variance permit application where the applicant has applied to formally allow for the reduction of the required interior side parcel line setback for an existing agricultural building. The variance is with regards to the standard requirement of 15 meters for the building from the property line, and requesting a variance to 8.9 meters. The property is located on the map before you. It's located near the intersection of Coke-Sila Road and Trans-Canada Highway, just to the northwest. It's a large agricultural property that notably has R2 zoned residential lands to the west. You'll see how that relates with these upcoming site plans, which are, of course, attached to the report. In this plan, I apologize of the scale, but Development Services is extremely happy to receive a site survey for this in conjunction with this application, which is sometimes unusual, especially where buildings are already pre-existing. But we applaud the applicant for providing us a registered survey, a verified survey by BC CLS surveyor, which shows the location of the buildings in gray right in the middle of the page there, highlighted with a red boundary. It's also again in your report, and it confirms that the exterior building wall is located as close as 8.5 meters from the western property boundary. I will note as well that you see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 residential properties on the western boundary and 2 to the south. All those neighbors, of course, because this is a development variance permit, were notified. We did receive some feedback, but no one in opposition. Only 2 neighbors contacted us to indicate their support for the application. Here's a maybe more helpful aerial photograph, which gives you a sense of what's going on the property. More or less to the north portion of the property, as I understand, it's hay production. To the south is more other types of farm use and the location of some property infrastructure, and then following standard approaches and guidelines for the location of farm buildings on agricultural property. This building is in conformance with the general expectation that all buildings be co-located in one location so as not to negatively influence the viability of the property for agricultural purposes. So on the basis of those points that I've raised, I'll remind you of the recommendation and open the floor to discussion.
Any questions for staff? Director Kuhn.
Yeah, I just wonder, was there a necessity to have a full survey done on that property? There's no other indication that there's any other setback requirements or infringements other than the one 8.9, which would have actually, I mean, just a crude measurement would have done that. And I wonder if there was a necessity for that, because I'm quite sure that wasn't a very cheap survey.
Mr. Batstow.
Well, the perspective of Development Services would be that it's very, very helpful, if not essential to have a survey that confirms the accuracy of the location, the degree of the variance that's being is submitted. I would add that for the property owner's comfort, knowing that the location is fully knowing that the building was erected in a manner that doesn't conform to our bylaws, it's helpful for them to, close this loop and get resolution that it's now approved to a certain point, and that certain point is 8.9 meters. Those are
Mr.
my
Blackwell.
comments.
Thank you. The other important issue to consider here is that our development application processes, for those that are not used to them, can be viewed as tricky, complicated. That's made more tricky when we have different rules for different people. So by keeping things consistent and the same rules apply to everybody means that you're going to have a bell curve scenario where most people will fit within the middle part of that bell curve, where these kinds of requirements are reasonable and appropriate. And then you're going to have some where you might argue that at the other end of the bell curve, perhaps, I can't see what the validation is for any given requirement. But the key here, as I say, from an operational perspective, is we need to have a level playing field. We have to apply consistent standards to everybody, because as soon as we start getting into the gray and picking and choosing who qualifies for special consideration, it creates a whole other issue of fairness and complexity.
Director Dory.
Thank you. This residential 2 subdivision that seems to be plopped in the middle of agricultural land is very unusual. Was it actually done before the 70s or something like that allows it to be we'd never do this in the modern world, where the people are completely surrounded in a subdivision by agricultural land. Do you have any idea how old the subdivision is?
My answer is I don't know the long history of the area, but I see a nod from Mr. Tibbet, who seems to indicate that the residential property was in existence prior to the establishment of the ALR.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions of staff? Is the applicant in the room? Do they have anything to add? Turn to the director for the area. Move the recommendation. Seconded by Director Davis. Mr. Blackwell, would you read the recommendation, please?
Thank you. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that development variance permit application number DVP 18E01 be approved by varying section 7.3 sub B sub 4 of zoning bylaw number 1840 from 15 meters to 8.9 meters.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor? Those opposed? The motion carries. R3, turn to Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to refer this back to staff.
Do we have a seconder? Moved and seconded. Call the question. All those in favor? Those opposed? That motion carries. Thank you, Director Yanni DiNardo. R4, Mr. Batstone.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, I'm presenting on behalf of Rochelle Rondeau. As I understand it, ESC is largely has been informed of the long story about how this rezoning application has come to be and how it has evolved over time. So I'll keep it at the high-level issues before I get to the recommendation, which, as you know, is staff's recommendation is to proceed to drafting of new zoning bylaw amendments and OCP amendments required. So I'll focus largely on the OCP policy issues, just to remind you of what has been considered to date and what public review and approval processes have occurred. On your maps, you see, on your screens, you see a map that shows the existing OCP designations. So the subject property is in the middle of your map, highlighted with an arrow, which currently is agriculturally designated. All these lands, you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 properties in a row as you lead up to Cowichan Golf and Country Club. Those are agricultural zone designated properties and surrounded mostly by agricultural land, except for the, which is the emerging, I would suggest, commercial node at the intersection. On the west side of the Trans-Canada Highway, some industrial lands and commercial, some new redevelopments there you may be familiar with. To the immediate south is a rural commercial designation for some existing properties that are currently operating as such. The policy matter that might be considered today, following Development Services recommendation, is policy number 442A of the existing bylaw, which states, in order to prevent highway sprawl, which erodes the appearance of rural landscapes and impacts traffic circulation, applications to designate additional lands as RC along the Trans-Canada Highway would generally not be supported. As you know from the history of this this file, this property was as recently as about 6 years ago designated commercial. It had changed to an agricultural designation, so it's arguable in some people's opinions as to whether this is actually an addition of lands as RC. It's essentially been deemed by APCs, referral agencies, and I believe this committee, that RC is generally appropriate in this particular circumstance. Now to the zoning. As you know, the OCP requires that the implementing zoning bylaw be in conformance with the OCP. So again, you'll see A7 zone lands here and consistent with the A designation, C3 to the south, which is the rural commercial designation, and C2 and C4 across the road in I-1. So this was also, as I briefly mentioned earlier, a discussion point at APC about how many commercial nodes along the Trans-Canada Highway are appropriate. I don't think that there's resolution on that topic. It'll likely be something you see more discussed in future OCP and zoning bylaw amendments. But I think it's suffice to say that there's general agreement that this is an existing commercial node, and so the reconversion, if you will, of the property back to commercial use is not inconsistent with the existing landscape nor the OCP policy. So following the recommendation that's before you, I'll just highlight the differences between the existing A7 zone and the proposed C2 zone. So again, this has been reviewed by APCs, referral agencies, and has gone to public hearing. And there's generally agreement that a hybrid zone, largely born out of the existing C2 zone, could be used to accommodate the current property as proposed, except where I have strike-throughs in red. So there was a motion to, as is reflected in the recommendation, to eliminate the specific permitted uses of auction, building supply sales, and wholesale sales. And as you know, I apologize that I haven't gone into this detail, but the current property owner, at least today, intends to operate a wedding planning and event planning business, which one might argue is consistent with the definition of personal service. So the C2 zone that's before you on the right of the slide would largely reflect, the future yet to be drafted zone would largely resemble the C2 list of permitted uses. So speaking to the OCP policy issue on that related matter, I'll just reiterate policy 441B, which is, in our opinion, Development Services opinion, largely consistent with the application. This policy states, for lands within the RC designation, the implementing zoning bylaw will provide a variety of zones to permit a diverse range of uses. So in this case, it's the A7. So the A7 restricts the broader agricultural uses, rural commercial uses. So it ticks that box, and then, but not limited to local commercial goods and services, professional services. One might argue that follows the description, the category and term that's appropriate for a wedding event planning service, retail agricultural sales, farm markets, tourism, restaurants, pubs, and service stations. As you know, those last few uses are not contained in the C2 zone as exists, so staff is not proposing to add restaurants and tourism, which again, going back to the commercial node conversation, would further erode the rural character of this particular area of Electoral Area D. So Again, I've probably already spoken to these issues, but these are the three highlights that staff have identified from the public hearing minutes. I think there was reviewing, look for your acknowledgement of this. Reviewing the minutes, staff feel that there was general support for an OCP rated designation from A, agricultural, to RC, commercial. There was also general support for the range of uses proposed, which would result in a restricted version of C2 zoning. And then lastly, the public have largely acknowledged that any future redevelopment of the site will be addressed within the auspices of development permit area requirements through a development permitting process. And if I haven't spoken to that issue, which I don't think I have, that specifically I'm talking about what's the building going to, answers to the question, what's the building going to look like, how much parking is going to be on site. We don't know that now. We don't need to know that to proceed to zone drafting. Those will all be dealt with in the future should the property ever redevelop from its current form. So I will remind you of the recommendation and return it to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Batstone. Mr. Blackwell, you have something to add?
Thank you. Just a placeholder for this notion that this raises a really important recognition that we have a legacy of this type of commercial use along that highway corridor. Excuse me. It's a legacy from an earlier era with a different philosophy around how to provide services to, or accommodate services to the community. And through the OCP excuse me, modernization process, this is perhaps an important issue for the new board to consider, and that is how to deal with that highway corridor and the messaging that it presents to the traveling community, as well as whether these random or quasi-random commercial retail uses either support existing commercial, the viability of existing commercial nodes and senses of place, or whether they start to distract from that. So those comments I offer up just for background thinking, because I think this is a reoccurring theme, and it's perhaps an issue that the CASC is going to want to contemplate in the future.
Thank you. Any questions for staff? Turn to the director for the area.
Thank you. I'd like to move the recommendation.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Director Nicholson. Would you like to speak to it?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to a little bit more to what Mr. Blackwell was speaking to as well. I think this was very valuable. We actually had a joint APC, so the Island Corridor, which we've talked about many times, even signage along the corridor from Ladysmith to the Malahat is something that we need to look at a fulsome discussion. And with the APCs of Area E and D, it was a great discussion on how this corridor, you know, was both sides of the highway should look. And I think that the public and the APCs did a very good job, and I appreciate that. So thank you.
Excellent. Any further discussion? Mr. Blackwell, would you read the recommendation, please?
Thank you. The recommendation before you is that amendment bylaws for application number 02D17RS at 4831 Trans-Canada Highway to permit event planning and the C2 uses exclusive of auction, building supply sales, and wholesaling be prepared.
Seeing no further hands, all those in favor and those opposed, the motion carries. It goes to the Wednesday, November 14th board meeting. Next item, R5, Mr. Tippett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's just a verbal report, as it says here, and it's concerning the next steps in our evolution of the cannabis regulations. We did adopt, as you will recall, in September, what I would call now interim amendments to our zoning bylaws concerning cannabis growing, retailing, and consumption premises, commercial consumption premises. We acknowledged at the public hearing that there was some additional work that needed to be done. And what we have been doing since then is thinking about how that work will be done. So today at noon, unfortunately I missed it, but a lot of the staff, planning staff were there. There was I think it was a PIBC webinar concerning cannabis, and we're collecting as much technical information as we can about the regulations and appropriate ways of dealing with it. And this thing I'd like to suggest to you today is just a recommendation regarding process. Because of our general trend to try and have regional approaches to land use matters, or we're at least moving in that direction, what I'd like to recommend is that we convene a regional advisory planning commission chair group, the same group essentially it's been meeting regarding the harmonization project, or will be meeting regarding that, to assist us in developing phase 2 of the cannabis regulations. So we just wanted to suggest that, and if there was any problem with it, I'd like to hear about it now. We just thought it would be an appropriate way to do it. We like to have consistent regulations throughout the region where we do have regulations. Not to say every community has to have the same regulations, just that if we're going to regulate things, that we take the similar approach for definitions and that sort of thing. So this is staff's recommendation, and I'd appreciate any feedback on it, and ultimately, if possible, a resolution in favor of the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Tippett. I've got myself on the list and would take any other comment direction. We've got Director Nicholson. Anyone else want to comment on this? Well, Yanni Tenardo. Thank you, Mr. Tippett, and I think it's a good starting point. My question is more around the given that you're proposing it be advisory planning commission chair group meeting, how will there be opportunities, and maybe it's not at this kind of meeting, but for there to be public, industry, and just concerned residents input on this sort of thing? Are you anticipating that this is an opportunity when this meeting is convened, or will it be another format? Because there is keen interest. We've had somebody in the gallery who's been asking about specific items at the ends of meetings. There's a keen interest. So how would we be taking that into consideration?
Mr. Chair, that's a good question. The intent of this group would be to assist staff in developing a set of proposals. And we always think that if we're going to engage the public on a matter, that it's important to have some options or proposals that they can react to, rather than just going with a blank sheet. Or it wouldn't quite be a blank sheet. We would be going with our existing regulations and saying, okay, we have this, what do you want to do now? I think we need to put our minds to what ultimately is a fairly highly technical matter related to federal regulation, provincial regulation, and zoning, come up with something that we think might be coherent with the assistance of the chairs, and then engage the public with a range of options after that. So that's the general plan. We haven't got to that sort of next step because we haven't got to the first one yet, but that's what we would propose to do.
Well, thank you. And just as a brief follow-up for not only yourself, but Mr. Blackwell, if this is the format that's being recommended, I see the value in what you're suggesting and the creation of, but I'd like to ensure that while our APC rules are very specific around public participation and in the deliberations, that perhaps that if this meeting were held, that there might be an opportunity for interested people to observe at the very least in the development of these recommendations. And don't know if staff have, I see nodding from Mr. Blackwell, so that would be a consideration for those?
Mr. Chair, yeah, that's right. I mean, any APC meeting, or in this case, a group of APC chairs meeting, constitutes a meeting under the Local Government Act, so it has to be an open meeting. Yeah, it goes without saying. I would hesitate to encourage public participation there. I don't think that's the right time. But there's nothing secret about it, and anyone would be entitled to observe, as you say.
Thank you. Director Nicholson?
Thanks. I've got a couple of questions. Just to follow along on this, I think it's a good idea to do this regionally. But I know that the group that's advising on the harmonization of the APC while we said it was just it was the sort of the chairs of all the APCs, in reality, we've got more people involved from the Area E APC who are interested in contributing to that because people can't always be at meetings. So I hope there's some flexibility and openness to having a more flexible membership.
Mr. Tippett?
Mr. Chair, yes, I think that's fair comment. I mean, the point is that we would prefer not to have to go to every individual APC, you know, all nine of them, and do this work in that fashion, but, and also not have to have a meeting with 148 people at it or whatever. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's some flexibility there. I don't think we're going to be rigid about, I'm sorry, you're not the chair. Well, I'm the vice chair. I think that would be fine if a vice chair or others want to come and observe, or maybe substitutions occur. That's up to the APC chairs involved, I think. We just need some representation from every one of the communities.
Okay.
Your second question?
So my second question is about the work that economic development's been doing on the cannabis front, and what kind of overlap or inclusion of that would happen?
Mr. Tippett?
Another good question. We're getting lots of good questions here.
Mike, they're always good questions.
Well, I know. I shouldn't have had to say that. Yeah, Janae is working here now, as you know, as a planning technician, and she was involved with that initiative when she was with economic development, so we're going to be involving her with it. There is definitely a liaison, and we're going to be having lots of discussions with Amy as well, just to tell her where we're going, and, her perspective on this is a business opportunity for the valley, and we shouldn't mess it up, and so that'll definitely be one of the prevailing themes that we're going to be, suggesting. There's got to be a way to find a niche for these businesses in the valley, and to encourage, conversion of, let's say, gray or black market operations to white market operations, so to speak, and encourage everyone to become normalized, regularized, licensed, and so on. The devil's in the details, though. But yeah, absolutely, we're going to work closely with economic development.
One more.
Final question?
So you've framed this as providing help on the regulation, creating the regulations. So this group will not be looking at applications and advising on applications?
Mr. Chair, the intent is not to have that sort of role at this point in time. It remains to be seen whether that would be an appropriate thing to do, and I can see where you're going with that. If they become, relatively speaking, experts in the subject matter over a period of meetings, when we receive applications for this sort of thing, why wouldn't we do that? And furthermore, if we develop policy on how to deal with future applications for certain uses that may not be permitted in whatever further amendments we make to the bylaws, it could be considered as an appropriate way to deal with that too, because I think there is value in having a regional approach for all, reasons already stated. However, I'm not recommending that right now. That's a discussion for another day, but I like the idea. I think we'd have to maybe work that through in a bit more depth.
Thank you.
So I'll just comment on that, if I may.
Okay.
I think we have to be really careful about that, because there is an application up the road from my house in Shawnigan, which was looked at by the APC for Shawnigan. And what I noticed was that APC had no idea about what's on the west side of the Coxsila River. And so I think when we are actually looking at applications where, a regional group with expertise would be helpful, I think it is going to be really important to make sure that we involve the community that will be affected, and not just to assume that, make assumptions for them.
Thank you, Director Nicholson. Director Yanni DiNardo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Tippett. I have a question on the actual group that's doing the harmonization of the OCPs, that they should be asked about this, and if there's more commitment from them than they had thought in the first place. I just wondered if the timeline would be longer, and that they're informed and asked about this as well, because we're actually asking them for another step.
Mr. Tippett?
Mr. Chair, yeah, that's correct. I mean, what I wanted to do is get committee's input on this before approaching them with that question, but of course that's right. They may say, well, wait a second, we're already overloaded. I'd like to hope that they will not say that, and they'll say, yeah, this is an important thing for the valley, we'd like to participate in it. I actually don't think it'll be all that onerous in the initial form that I'm proposing here, where we're not reviewing applications and so on, where we're just getting advice. It might only amount to 2 meetings or something like that. So, but yes, it's a good point.
Thank you.
And I've got myself on the list, and just really quickly, in regards to the reporting, what would be the process from the results of these meetings? Is this coming back for regulation by law for the Electoral Area Services Committee? And the second part to that is there a timeline, anticipated timeline as to when we might see the work product from this exercise?
Yes, Mr. Chair. The approach here is to do this work with this group, develop some workable ideas and policies, bring them back to this committee with a recommendation to go out to the public sessions referred to earlier. And so there would be one hopes, a degree of buy-in from the elected officials before we start engaging with the public on something that, you know, hasn't been through the actual decision makers. Did that answer your question, or was there
Fair
a
enough,
second
yep.
part to it? Okay, thanks.
Second part was timeline. Are we
Oh, timeline,
talking
right.
February or August, or what are you thinking?
We have a lot on our plate right now, Mr. Chair, and our priority is harmonization for sure. So we're going to do this as we can, and I suspect it will probably be maybe a little bit later in the springtime, like I'm thinking March, April perhaps. I'm not sure. We haven't actually begun the technical work in earnest that we need to do before we meet with the APC chair group. So I will say March, April maybe for the meetings.
Thank you. Director Yanni Denardo to close.
I was just going to move the recommendation.
Excellent. We have a recommendation mover, seconded by Director Marcotte. Any further discussion? I'll call the question. All those in favor and those opposed, that motion carries. Just a quick note to everyone that for those that are returning and for the new directors, we will have to be getting at the appointments of our new committees, APCs and parks, very soon after next week. So just so that everyone's aware of that, and turn to Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you. Just further to that, I will be sending a letter out, a memo out to each of the returning directors and to the new directors, talking a little bit more about your APCs and presenting a slight modification to the process as it has been historically for purposes of greater transparency and inclusivity. There's an ask in that memo, so I would direct your attention to the bolded, highlighted bit, because it's I'm requesting that I hear back from each director so that I can ascertain whether or not there's consensus on that issue. So look forward to that memo on that very issue on the 8th of November.
And just for its enhancements to our current process is the intent of this. Director Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought all the appointments were until December 31st, or will they be null and void on the 7th?
Mr. Blackwell informs me that the research has been done and APCs end at the end of the term. Next item, R6. Mr. DeJong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before you is a report regarding the Malahat Volunteer Fire Department and their budget for the emergency power generator. Earlier this year, we conducted a request for proposals to have a supply of an emergency power generator. All the proposals and extra solicited bids and quotes were over the budgeted amount of $15,000 that the board had approved through capital gas tax reserves. Our next lowest bid or quote is $21,000 plus applicable taxes. So we're looking for approval to go ahead with this. The savings to fund this will occur through the 2018 budget and any surpluses that are within the operating budget.
Any questions for staff? Director Dory.
Would this generator be mobile, like would it be on a truck, or like could it go to a certain facility and supply power to it? Or is it just for the actual fire hall?
Mr. DeJong.
The generator is static. It's mounted for the fire hall. It is not mobile. It's for the fire station alone.
Any other questions for staff? Seeing none, turn to the director for the area.
It's actually 64% paid for by Area B, but I'll move it.
Would you like to second it, Director Acton?
No, yes.
It's been moved and seconded. Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you. The recommendation before you is that it be recommended to the board that the purchase of an emergency power generator fixed to the ground, just kidding, for the Malahat Volunteer Fire Department for a maximum cost of $21,000 plus applicable taxes, with any amounts over the original budget to be funded by 2018 operating surplus.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor? Those opposed? The motion carries. That too will go to the 14th of November. And can I ask open microphones to be turned off, please? Next item, Mr. Dennison, R7 Cobble Hill Village Sewer Bylaws.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So after obtaining a wonderful $1.9 million grant to integrate the Cobble Hill Sewer System, Galliers, and Twin Cedars, and going to the public with a successful AAP process and establishing the new service establishment bylaw, it is now time to approve the Capital Reserve Fund bylaw, the Parcel Tax Roll bylaw, and the Management bylaw for the new integrated Cobble Hill Village Sewer System. Rates will be $500 user fee and $400 parcel tax per year, as promised the community.
Thank you. Any questions for staff? Director Dory.
So are the rates going up or going down or staying the same?
Mr. Chairman, there's two existing service areas involved. For the Twin Cedars service area, they're going down by $200 a year. For the what we call the Cobble Hill Sewer System, or the Galliers, it's going up. But in that case, that's avoiding a much larger increase that they would have had to have undergone had they carried out an upgrade on their own. So the integration is good news for them, and again, the AAP passed very easily in the area.
Any further questions for staff? Seeing none. Moved by Director Acton, seconded by Director Davis. Mr. Blackwell, would you read the recommendation, please?
Thank you. The recommendation before you is that Cobble Hill Village Sewer System Capital Reserve Fund Establishment Bylaw 4238, Cobble Hill Village Sewer System Parcel Tax Roll Bylaw number 4239, and Cobble Hill Village Sewer System Management Bylaw number 4240 be forwarded to the board for consideration of 3 readings and adoption.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor and those opposed, the motion carries. That will go to the 14th board meeting as well. R8, Mr. Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have recommendations before you for increase in maximum requisition limits. So that's not the rates of tax, it's the maximum requisition allowed for the whole service area for Burnham Water, Lambourne Water, Mill Springs Sewer, and Lambourne Sewer. Particularly as our systems expand, we need to expand the requisition limit, which we're allowed to do by 25% every 5 years only, so that the parcel tax may remain the same at the same rate because we have more customers, right? So that of itself would increase their total requisition, and we need to be able to increase the requisition limit to go with it. And we find that chronically in our systems, a lot of them have expansions in the number of customers, new developments or subdivisions or whatnot, and so we need to regularly increase the parcel tax limits with that. The requisition limit does not mean necessarily, though, an increase in the parcel tax. That has to be approved separately through the budgeting process, so they're not necessarily the same thing. Also, something of consideration too is that parcel tax and user fees end up somewhat applying to different people in different ways. So for example, in one of our service areas here before you in Lambourne, we have a fairly large mobile home park of quite low income customers. And if we increase the user fees, they all pay that user fee very directly. But if we increase the parcel tax, they divide it because they're on one parcel by 50 of them or so that are in the mobile home park. So there can be differences in how those costs end up getting applied. Most of our costs in our utilities are not discretionary. We're subject to, you know, if the operators have to respond, they have to do sampling or repair work or whatever else, those are our costs. We really don't have much choice. So if we're increasing one or the other because of those kinds of costs, then, you know, there can be a difference in how that gets applied. The other thing too, we are working on asset management, and we're anticipating that for some of these, many of our customers or many of our utilities, they're going to have to look at some increases in rates if they're going to set aside money in order for long-term replacement. So it's easier to have those requisition limits increased already when we have the opportunity in advance. So we are recommending all of these. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Dennison. This is one of those math and utility questions that could require a whole workshop just to understand how these things
Yes.
work, and appreciate your diligence in this. I've got Director Yanni DiNardo and Dory. Anyone else? Director Yanni DiNardo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you to Mr. Dennison. I just wondered if, I know we had just in our previous presenter, a regional advisory commission, and I'm still wondering where and when we're going to get our advisory, or whatever we called it, the committee to oversee all the service areas for sewer and water. Is
Mr.
that
Dennison.
still on the books, and when will that happen?
It is on the books. In consultation with our CIO, we talked about that and thought, let's, because it's running into the new board, we thought, let's give them a little chance to get their feet under them. It's quite, some of these matters are quite complex, and it takes a little while to get the picture before you can really bring forward a good decision on these things. So we thought we'd wait a little while now with the new board, get their feet under, and we will bring that forward.
Okay, thank you, because that's been quite a few years. Thank you.
Director Dory?
Yeah, thank you. When it comes to parcel taxes and user fees, we found in Saltaire it was better to raise the parcel tax because seniors and people on minimum income could waive their taxes and waive the parcel tax, but you can't waive a user fee. So that when we had to raise the rates by quite a bit, we found out that it was good to put the parcel tax up rather than the user fees, so that those people who wanted to waive their taxes would benefit from that. Yeah, thank you.
Director Davis?
Thank you, and thank you for the report. I was just wondering if user fees are likely to go down a corresponding amount to make the same overall cost for any of these?
It's possible, Mr. Chairman. It's something we can consider. We have done that in other areas, especially when we've been increasing the user fees because of hitting a requisition limit because of expansions in service areas. So Sentinel Ridge is an example where once we came up to the 5-year time period and we're able to change the requisition limit, we actually dropped the user fees and increased the parcel tax instead. So that is an option that we certainly look at in all our systems if we have that opportunity.
And it says in the report, it says on 2 of them, I think it said it's likely to be raised to the maximum right away in order to counteract that. And is that because the one of them, I guess, was not done 2 years ago when it was able to be done?
In some cases, yes, we would be looking at that. Again, we bring it forward in the budgeting process, though, and so it would be a board decision at the end. But yes, that's something we might be looking at for that one.
Thank you.
Director Yanni DiNardo?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also had a question in Lambourne, in particularly secondary suites and service charges. How did we work out the secondary suites? Our OCP encourages that. How does that work out for service charges?
Mr. Dennison?
Mr. Chairman, we are planning to, we have been working on a unified management bylaw for all of our sewer utilities in one, and all the water utilities in another. That's been being worked on by our admin staff, and they had an election recently, so they've been a little busy. But they promise us that we will be getting that forward quite soon. In that new management bylaw, we're proposing to drop the user fee rates and the connection fees for secondary suites for a variety of reasons, which we'll bring forward in more detail later. But it's you know, it's a sort of an affordable housing type of issue. Also, if we provide too high in a barrier, people will do it illegally, and it's much better to have them on board legally and not have such a barrier to prevent that from happening. So there's other reasons as well. So we'll be bringing that forward when we have that unified bylaw, and we're hoping for that fairly soon.
Great, thank you.
And just sort of a final comment, again, I applaud your staff for the work because it's a very complex formula to get just right, the mix between the user fee and the parcel tax, and I think each utility is almost unique in the application of those, and difficult to sort of have that discussion in a larger format, and encourage any director that may have questions around these to sit down with staff. They're very helpful and help to clarify what's a fairly complex issue. So we have a recommendation. Do we have a mover? Moved by Director Davis, seconded by Director Yanni DiNardo. Mr. Blackwell, would you please read the recommendation?
Thank you. Excuse me. The recommendation is four-part. That it be recommended to the board, 1, CVRD bylaw number 3707, Burnham Water System Service Establishment bylaw 2013, be amended to increase the maximum annual requisition limit to $59,000. 2, CVRD bylaw number 3034, Lambourne Estates Water System Service Establishment bylaw 2008, be amended to increase the maximum annual requisition limit to $51,500, I should say. Number 3, CVRD bylaw number 3711, Mill Springs Sewer System Service Establishment bylaw 2013, be amended to increase the maximum annual requisition limit to $137,000. And lastly, CVRD bylaw number 3052, Lambourne Estates Sewer System Service Establishment bylaw 2008, be amended to increase the maximum annual requisition limit to $39,000.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? Those opposed? That motion carries, and that'll go to the 14th as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dennison. No unfinished business. We have 2 new business items. We have a grant aid from Director Acton. Would you please let the committee know what the details are?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry for the last minute due to the election, and then soon our board meeting is quite far away. I didn't want to wait. But this is a grant to a youth in our community, Kaylin Cook, and it's for a British Columbia Youth Parliament that's held in Victoria for 5 days, and this is a portion of the tuition towards that. And I just actually changed the amount. It's actually $350 when I had a chance to go back and look.
So it's less than the amount
Yeah.
on the form. Okay, thank you. So you're
Right.
moving grant aid for $350. Do we have a seconder? Seconded by Director Marcotte. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none, call the question. All those in favor? Those opposed? That motion carries. Next item, turn to Director Nicholson.
So this is about cannabis production and on agricultural land reserve land. So we know we have cannabis production going on in our community. And as we go through this transition period, I think it's really important that we understand what best management practices would look like, including on agricultural land. So we don't have a lot of control over what happens on agricultural land as far as farming goes, but this is a new farming use. And I know that we have in Area E a lot of agricultural land, and we have cannabis growing facilities in operation now that are not welcomed by the neighbors because of noise issue, odor issues and so forth. So I think it would be good if, and I'd like to make a motion to this effect that, I should read it out, shouldn't I? I sent it around. And I did have a word wrong in there, but the motion is to direct staff to clarify with the Agricultural Land Commission and Ministry of Agriculture acceptable best management practices for cannabis production, including odor, nutrient and waste management, and water use.
Are you moving that?
I did.
Seconded by Director Acton. Any discussion on the item? Director Dory.
The agricultural land reserve people or the commission, do they have this information readily available? Is it like online, the best management for that, for cannabis, or is it just something that is not done yet.
I think that's specifically the intent, is to get it in a package and present for our information. Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you. So this has been alluded, sorry, through you to
Yes.
Director Dory. This has been alluded to earlier with regard to essentially the right to farm legislation, the FPPA legislation. So when there is a complaint against a farm activity, there is a process that's followed, and a piece of that process is that industry representatives will get together, convene a meeting, and assess the degree to which any given agriculture or the agricultural activity that's being questioned conforms to normal farm practice. There are long-standing guidelines or parameters around what is considered normal farm practice for things, for industries like poultry, eggs, dairy, and so on and so forth. It's uncertain the degree to which there is an established regimen of accepted normal farm practice when it comes to cannabis production. That said, what the resolution directs is investigation of that to see if and where that work has been done. I would expect that the Ministry of Agriculture has undertaken some of that, but it might be a situation where it's an ongoing exercise to fully understand how the operation of cannabis production facilities might change over time. They've developed in a way that I suspect represents or reflects the fact that they've been, to some degree, flying under the radar and not necessarily what is optimal best practice if it's permitted and regulated. So that might or might not influence what normal farm practice will look like. It certainly helps having that information when it comes to bylaw enforcement or complaints, if those complaints can be vetted against what is considered normal farm practice or is outside of that. So it's a long answer, but it's a little bit complex. My hope is that the ministry has undertaken some body of research around that.
Any further questions? Director Dory?
So by asking the question or asking for the information, you're prodding them to come up with best practices, or is that the strategy?
And I would suggest that this is a case of us knowing what the rules are and being well informed. Beyond that, Mr. Batstone.
I won't take too much of your time, but if it gives you any confidence, I was sitting in the webinar, I think you saw me earlier, in which I heard ministry representatives confirm that as of today, the expectation of the ministry is that cannabis businesses conform to the normal practices that Mr. Blackwell just outlined. They are looking at the option of going above and beyond specifically for cannabis uses. They're conducting the research. There may be something, I would imagine it has to be for a really darn good reason, but because, as we know, cannabis is not too much different than any other crop. And I'll just add a little level that is going to be really important as we're learning more about this. As I understand it, and I could be largely misinformed, but I think I'm on the right path. The stinkiest portion, if you will, of this production process is at the processing level. It's not when a plant is in the ground or in a greenhouse. It's when you actually start clipping and harvesting. Product eventually arrives in people's hands. And Health Canada themselves have prescribed standards for the buildings in which processing will be required to be happening. It's not going to be allowed to happen in an open field. So that's where it becomes very different and starts to shift from a obviously agricultural land use to a more industrial agricultural land use. And Health Canada are currently the holders of those standards. They require that charcoal filters and emission. There's a whole section of the Cannabis Act that speaks to the standards in broad terms about what the expectation will be. So to wrap it up, the province needs to hear more from Health Canada about how that's actually going to work, where plants are being grown in the ground, what it means for the processing component of this whole stream of activities, and then local governments will be the last people to pick up the unacknowledged areas that our communities would like us to control and regulate.
So thank you for that. We've got a request for a report, and that's what will come back to committee, and I think it's a fulsome and reasonable request. So with that, any other discussion on this item? Call the question. All those in favor? Those opposed? The motion carries. I believe the next item on the agenda is question period. Do we have anyone in the gallery that would like to pose a question to the very last Electoral Area Services Committee meeting of the term?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. I hope you'll let me just say very briefly before I ask my question, thank you to the people that will no longer be around this table for all that you have done for our communities and as a whole. We've greatly appreciated working with you. And for those that are going to be returning, welcome back. And we look forward to working with you in the future. I would like to ask a comment about R4, and just would like to say that working as chair of the area EAPC, it was very useful for us to have the opportunity to work with Area D APC on the Trans-Canada Highway vision, what we see as appropriate for development down the road. At those meetings, we thought it would be helpful to work with the APCs from area A, B, C, D, and E, because we all have frontages. So I hope that my question is, and request would be that you encourage that when you look forward, because I think it was a very useful operation. Speaking to R5, the APC, at the harmonization project, there was the APC chairs and an alternate, not necessarily the vice chair. And my question would be, my request would be that you consider that moving forward, and that when we have the OCP and now a cannabis request, it may be different people that want to sit on the OCP harmonization, modernization, and the cannabis, because they're two very big files, and that people would have a desire to be involved in those as well. I'm looking forward to Mr. Blackwell's notice on suggested changes for the APCs. One thing I would like to see, and I hope it could be done, is that all APC meetings be advertised on the CVRD calendar. I know we've run into some concerns when APC's meetings were not advertised to the public, and I think that's very important that they are open to the public, and I hope that will be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have a question for the chair today? Seeing none, that concludes question period. I just want to take a very brief moment before we call for adjournment, because we have no closed session items, to thank Director Dory, Director Davis, Director Clement for their service of their communities. It's been an honor and pleasure to have you here, and also like to thank my colleagues at the table for the opportunity to serve as your chair, and once again I consider it an honor and a privilege, and thank you for that. And I see Director Davis would like to say something. Thank you, Director Yanni Donardo, but Director Davis, do you have an exiting remark?
I do, thank you. And it's certainly been an interesting 4 years, filled with all kinds of ups and downs, and I've certainly learned a lot about local government and people and myself. And before getting elected and from the outside, it's sure not at all like what it seems. Like, from the outside, and for a while after being elected, I didn't understand what staff's roles were, and well, it took me a while to trust them, of course, because the things one reads out in the wide world there are often so far off the mark it's ridiculous. But staff's two roles of essentially recommending to the board what to do and then executing what the decisions are, those are the two basic things. And as an elected official, it's pretty well, you can't do your job without staff. There's really good staff here, and I've got to know a lot of them quite well, and it's been great working with them. They're always here, and they have to try to explain to us what they think we should do, and whether we agree with them or not, they'll still do it. So I've been, yeah, it's a real privilege working with all the staff here and with directors. It's been, yeah, quite an interesting 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Davis and Director Dory, to close.
Thank you. As I pass on into retirement land.
Pass
I was-
through, pass through.
Okay. When you get to be 76, you got to watch how you use that term.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm wondering who's going to ask the difficult questions when I'm not here. The ones that are hypothetical, that may be a little off topic, maybe a little bit going in a different direction. But, you know, at least it keeps people thinking and that sort of thing. And I won't miss being ruled out of order or that sort of thing. Anyway, it's been a really good experience for me over the 13 years. I often thought of it as taking a master's degree in local government or master's degree in life, because what you do here, you're dealing with sewer, water, you're dealing with people, homelessness, you're dealing with issues of life. And that's important, and you're the closest government to the people. People come to you and they want solutions, they want you to support them. And that's what your job is, and that's a good thing. I want to thank the staff for helping me stick handling through this purchase of the school. It was a very tough battle, and I think the community is going to thank me, if not tomorrow, 25 years from tomorrow, because it's turning into a really good facility. Today they were spray foaming the ceiling in the gym to have the greenhouse gases taken care of. Director Nicholson, we're taking care of the gases. we're dropping our CO2 use that way. So I just want to thank the staff, because they've been very supportive and done a lot for our community. And I think the community, generally speaking, really admires what the staff do. I've taken some people on a tour of the building and met the staff, and the people were very impressed with the professionalism here and the way they handle issues, always being honest and out with the answers. I think that's a great thing, and if you can continue that, I think we'll be in good shape. So, and working with the directors, I haven't always seen eye to eye with everybody around the table, but generally speaking, we're moving on, and we're doing the work of the people. So thank you a lot for this experience. It's kept me awake at night with either nightmares or fantasies about the way things could be. So thanks a lot, and I'll be checking in on you to see how you're doing. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Director Dory, and a final thank you to all of you for your support and your work in this term. And really close, do you want to have the final word? I'm trying to wrap up here.
Yeah, no, I thought maybe I'll offer myself now and then. I'll just ask a Mel Dory question, just to just to keep the level up there.
Well, next year, or next term's EASC chair better be ready for them. With that, I'd like to conclude by wishing everyone a safe and happy Halloween tonight. Watch out for the kids on the road, and see those of you that'll be back on November the 7th. Thank you.
Move for
Motion to
adjournment.
adjourn. Second, all in favor? Opposed? Thank you, everyone.